And so we're going to be studying what is climate and what are the factors that go into affecting the climate of a region. So let's start by defining what climate is. Climate is the long-term average conditions of temperature, precipitation, winds, and clouds in a region. And this should definitely be in your notes that climates are defined in terms of both precipitation and temperature. So those are the two factors that are going to determine kind of what the climate is for a region. And so these two factors are the defining characteristics of the climate of a region. So let's look at some things that are going to affect temperature and precipitation of an area. We're going to start with what will affect temperature. So factors affecting temperature. The big one is latitude. Factors affecting temperature. Right, and this is pretty logical, right? Generally, if you're closer to the equator, it's going to be warmer, right? And we can see that here. The areas closest to the equator, this line right here, tend to be tropical, right? A little farther north or south, we get into subtropical zones. We get into temperate zones, right? And then finally, we get into cold or polar zones, right? And you can see how we're kind of in a subtropical / temperate zone. We're kind of right on the edge here in Atlanta. The rest of the northern United States is going to be much more in a temperate, and then northern Canada, Alaska is going to be in a colder subarctic or Arctic zone, right? Notice these lines aren't totally straight because there are other factors that will affect temperature too. The other big one being altitude, right? In general, a higher altitude is going to be colder than a lower altitude, right? So places that are high and mountainous are going to have colder temperatures than places lower and closer to sea level. And we know this because as you go up in elevation through the troposphere, temperatures get colder. Last two factors affecting temperature: distance from water, right? Large bodies of water, and by that I mean bays, gulfs, oceans, not lakes, right? The Great Lakes would be about the smallest thing that could have an impact on this, but even they don't really have a large impact. But large bodies of water, we say moderate climate, meaning they make it less extreme. The colds are less cold, the hots are less hot. So the differences between summer and winter are less extreme. If you were to go to Savannah in the summer, it doesn't get quite as hot as it does in Atlanta, and it doesn't get quite as cold in the winter because the Atlantic Ocean there, right, keeps the temperature a little bit more constant because water takes so long to heat up and cool down. The other factor is ocean currents, right? Just like we saw there are wind belts, there are ocean currents as well. These currents can bring either warm or cold water, right? The Atlantic Ocean, we have what's called the Gulf Stream coming up the east coast of the United States and then eventually goes over to Europe, to England and France and Scandinavia. England is way farther north than anywhere in the United States, but their climate is pretty similar to New York's, even though they're farther north because of this warm water. On the west coast, you've got cold water coming down, right? So if you've ever been to the ocean in San Francisco, you know that the water there is freezing, right? Even though it's at the same latitude as maybe Virginia. So these ocean currents can definitely influence the temperature of land. So those are our factors that are going to affect temperature in a region. Let's now take a look at some factors affecting precipitation. Right? The first big one is what we call our prevailing winds, right? Our trade winds, our prevailing westerlies, or our polar easterlies. Depending on where you are, these winds can either bring moisture or drier air. Right? If you're on the west coast of the U.S., if you're in Seattle, those prevailing westerlies are going to bring water in off the ocean. On this side of the country, they don't bring as much water. Doesn't mean that we're drier, but that's why Seattle gets a lot more precipitation over the course of the year. Next is seasonal winds, right? These are big shifts in seasonal winds, and you learned about these, especially in geography when you learned about monsoons, or if you haven't done that yet, you definitely will. These are basically giant sea and land breezes. The most famous is in India. So in the summer, the land gets really hot, right, and creates a giant, basically, sea breeze coming in off the water that affects most of the continent. When that water comes in, it brings moisture, and you get lots of rain. In the winter, the land cools off, the ocean is warmer, and you've got wind coming back out to huge shifts in the monsoon winds bring either moisture or dry air, depending on the season. And our last factor that's going to affect precipitation is mountains. All right? Mountains will force air upwards where it's going to cool and cause precipitation. Right? And again, India, there's a big example of this. Right? You've got the Himalayas, right here. You can see the white snow caps in the mountains. When that monsoon water comes in, when the monsoon air comes in and gets forced up by the Himalayas, all that water condenses and falls as rain. You can see on the ocean side of the mountain range, you've got lots of water, right? Lots of green as a result of all that rainfall. On the backside, you get much drier air, the desert. You get this in the United States as well. If you go from California, if you go in towards Nevada, you cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, right? On the ocean side of that, you get lots of rain. They grow lots of produce and crops there. On the far side, you get the desert where Las Vegas is. So, the examples of this pretty much all over the place. Those are the main factors of climate. Right, that's kind of our introduction. We'll start our climate change project tomorrow, but now you're kind of familiar with what climate is and what are the factors that affect it. So make sure you put 3 questions at the bottom of your notes. We'll take a look at those tomorrow before we start our project, and have a good night.